Prohibition is defined as the action of forbidding something, especially by law. And on January 19, 1919, the 18th Amendment passed to prohibit the sale of alcohol in the United States of America. The 18th Amendment went into effect a year later, by which time no fewer than 33 states had already enacted their own prohibition legislation. In October of 1919, Congress passed the National Prohibition Act, which provided guidelines for the federal enforcement of prohibition. Championed by Representative Andrew Volstead of Mississippi, the chairman of the House of Judiciary Committee at the time, the legislation was more commonly known as the Volstead Act. This prohibition wasn't the first in U.S. history either. In 1917, after the United States had entered World War I, President Woodrow Wilson instituted a temporary wartime prohibition in order to save grain for producing food. That same year is when Congress submitted the 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors for state ratification. Though Congress had stipulated a 7-year time limit for the process, the amendment received support of the necessary 3/4 of U.S. states in just 11 months. Before Prohibition even became a possibility, a lot of things were happening in America. By the turn of the century, temperance societies were a common fixture in communities across the United States. Women played a strong role in the temperance movement as alcohol was seen as a destructive force in families and marriages. In 1906, a new wave of attacks began on the sale of liquor, led by the Anti-Saloon League and driven by a reaction to urban growth, as well as rising the Christian faith and its view on saloon culture as a corrupt and ungodly. In addition, many factory owners supported prohibition in their desire to prevent accidents and increase the efficiency of their workers in an era of increased industrial production and extended working hours. Even though there was a strong following in the temperance movement that supported prohibition, both federal and local governments struggled to enforce prohibition over the course of the 1920s. Enforcement was initially assigned to the IRS and was later transferred to the Justice Department. In general, prohibition was enforced much more strongly in rural and small town areas and much more loosely in urban areas. Despite being very successful in the early stages, including a decline in arrests for drunkenness and a reported 30% drop in alcohol consumption, those who wanted to continue drinking found more creative ways to do it. The illegal manufacturing and sale of liquor known as bootlegging went on throughout the decade, along with the operation of stores or nightclubs selling alcohol known as speakeasies. The earliest bootleggers began smuggling foreign-made commercial liquor into the United States from across the Canadian and Mexican borders. The smuggling and homemaking of alcohol made it an unregulated industry, which meant people had to pay whatever the seller wanted. The high price of bootleg liquor meant that the nation's working class and poor were far more restricted during the Prohibition than middle or upper-class Americans. Even as costs for law enforcement, jails, and prisons spiraled upward, support for the Prohibition was waning by the end of the 1920s. In addition, fundamentalists and nativist forces had gained more control over the temperance movement, alienating its more moderate members. A main cause Prohibition ended, and with it bootlegging, was because the nation wanted to create jobs, and the opening of an industry did that for them.
Bootlegging is the illegal business of transporting alcohol during the time of the Prohibition era. The term bootleggers originated in the Midwest to denote the practice of hiding flasks of liquor in boots. Among the many bootleggers, some people like Popcorn Sutton and Lucky Lucchino made a fortune selling the illegal liquor to underground bars and people looking to end their own personal drought. With the bootlegging epidemic breaking across the United States, organized crime began to rise, and many gangs like the Mafia began to seek their fame in the illegal underground liquor business. Bootlegging became a major problem and started becoming violent, with car chases and shootouts with the police. It was clearly an issue at the time. The bootleggers associated with the illegal liquor only became more violent, with the police cracking down. The only thing to stop the violence would be the end of the Prohibition era.